Do I need to turn this on? Or is it on? It's already on.
Ready, action. Welcome everyone to the Alwaleed Center for American Studies and Research. Tonight, it's my very great pleasure to introduce my friend and former intellectual doppelganger until she stopped working on torture and shifted to logistics, Laleh Khalili. Laleh Khalili is a professor of Middle East politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She's the author of Heroes and Martyrs, The Politics of National Commemoration, which was published by Cambridge in 2007, and one of the finest books, really, of the 21st century, Time in the Shadows, Confinement and Counterinsurgencies, published by Stanford in 2013. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. And she's currently working on an ESRC-funded project on ports, logistics, and maritime transport infrastructures in the Arabian Peninsula. And this is the topic of her talk tonight, Coercion and Capital in the Making of Arabian Transport Infrastructure. So join me in welcoming Laleh Khalili.
So Lisa is usually way too extravagant in her praise, but I haven't left the torture stuff. Weirdly, I'm not sick of that yet, so I'm actually giving talks still on counterinsurgency. No, you never leave it. It's too sexy. Anyway, I'm very grateful for you guys being here today. It's a beautiful day outside. You know, if it were me, I would be at the beach. But anyway, so thank you for being here regardless. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a talk, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. And if you have, particularly about the sources that I'm using, etc., I'd be quite happy to talk about that as well. Okay. Among the holdings of the British Museum, warehoused in their massive storage among around 8 million objects, most of which are never on display, is a carved dark gravestone inscribed in Hebrew and dated 1333 AD, so about 700 years old, from the port of Aden in Yemen. The inscription says, "Mayest thou rest in peace until the Redeemer cometh. In the month of Tebeth was gathered in peace to her fathers the worthy, respected woman, Madmiyeh, the daughter of Saudiyeh, the son of Abraham. May his memory be blessed." End quote. The stone, which was, again, originally set in 1333, was donated to the British Museum in 1886 by Thomas Holdsworth Newman of the shipping firm Messrs. Newman, Hunt and Company. The stone had been brought over to Britain, however, 30 years earlier, so in mid-19th century, when it had been used as ballast for a ship sailing from India to Zanzibar and onwards to Britain. I've tried to find out what sort of ship this was and what it carried, but have not been successful yet. The shipping firm itself owned whalers in Newfoundland, vineyards in Oporto in Portugal, and traded, in addition to Indian Ocean ports, with Mediterranean ports. There's much about this object that I would love to note here. There's also a curator at British Museum who's actually going to be writing a proper article about this. So I'm really looking forward to that. It speaks of a long history of Jewish diasporic existence in Aden in Yemen. It bespeaks of an imperial carelessness that plunders gravestones for ballast. And it points to Aden as a significant, perhaps the most significant, coaling station between Europe and India, which is when the gravestone was loaded on as ballast. I want to say a few words about ballasts, and then I shall shift to Aden itself. In his beautiful short reflection on ships' ballasts, Charlie Haley recalls Joseph Conrad's obsession with ballast, telling us that ships are either in cargo or in ballast, where the weight, in this instance of stone, but later of coal and still later of seawater, is required to balance the ship when the ship is low on cargo. Landscapes were harvested of ballast, looted clean of sand and shingle and rock. And although ballast may speak of empty ships, that's what we usually think about, of ships that have delivered their goods in one direction and are now sailing in the opposite direction with their cargo already heaved to port, it also speaks of resource extraction in ways that would be considered unproductive, but which are fundamental to capitalist trade. This resource extraction transformed landscapes in ways that have been forgotten. Once a ship arrived in port, ballast had to be discarded, and despite laws that prevented the discharging of stone and shingle and sand into the sea, Haley tells us that discarded ballast spawned landscapes born of displaced materials from far-flung lands. And ballast islands and hills, this wastage, ended up becoming infrastructure, with these unwitting spoils of trade repurposed for buildings, roads, and railways. So, in fact, a lot of the gravel that is used in railways to put down the rail is actually ballast that was imported from long ago, which they are repurposing as transport material. Today, however, seawater is often used as ballast. And when seawater from one geography is released in port in another geography, there's much concern about invasive species and about the uncanny mixing of waters, organism, and pollution. And in fact, this is a huge issue in maritime trade. It's the sort of species you end up bringing in, for example, to port of Beirut from, I don't know, from Malta or from India or from China. And the harvesting and dumping of ballast also echoes through the dredging and land reclamation processes that transform landscapes, looting far riverbeds of Myanmar, for example, for gravel to be poured on the seabeds of Singapore, Indonesia in the seabeds of Dubai, or of ancient marine topographies, particularly coral seabeds in the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, ripped up to accommodate ships with deeper drafts. I think ballast is crucial in thinking about shipping precisely because it reminds us that the movement of ships across the seas is not simply about the movement of cargo, about production and circulation, or at least it doesn't stop there. That the ostensible routes of trade also map geographies of empire, and of new physical landscapes, of forms of labor and rule, of remade ecologies, and of course of forms of imperial hierarchy, which see nothing in using a 600-year-old gravestone of a young Jewish woman as a weight to keep a ship in equilibrium. But I also want to talk about Aden, and I do so because the rise and fall of Aden, as once the most important port of the Middle East, and today as a destroyed backwater, lacerated by bombs and missiles and siege, also says something about other ghostly presences of the empire and imperial forms in today's logistics. The sublime aesthetics, the awe and terror of logistical landscapes, all those extraordinary vast ports with their cranes reaching to sky and puzzle pieces of containers stacked in asymmetrical mountains, often conjure up an irrevocable rupture from the past. People usually say, oh my God, look at a container port. It looks nothing like before. This is completely new. It's an age of logistics, etc., etc. Heralding something new as yet unseen, as a kind of threshold of transformation in the character of capitalism. We hear about an age of logistics or technologies of circulation and automation that remake the world in ways not yet seen. I don't deny the awe that I feel when moving through these logistical landscapes, with transport infrastructures mapping not only what is, but what goes and what becomes. I admit that whenever I visit a port city, the first thing I do is to organize a tour of industrial harbors, look for the palimpsest of histories of trade and the crumbling wharves, or the sleek and streamlined container terminals. I even drag my kids on these container terminal tours. Actually, they've become really interested in the big container ships, so hey, it's working. I confess that flying over busy straits, say Bosphorus or Malacca or Gibraltar, that extraordinary traffic in ships, especially the long, sleek tankers and the behemoth container ships, exhilarates me. But despite the feeling of newness in this aesthetic sublime, these logistical landscapes, both at land and at sea, are haunted by their and our colonial pasts. In what remains, I will reflect on these hauntings through a discussion of capital and coercion in the making and the emergence and decline of ports and maritime transport infrastructures in the Arabian Peninsula, and especially Aden. Whether it's route making and enduring transoceanic connections of labor and trade and war, or it is the geography of ports and inland transportation, crossroads and hubs, today's transportation sector echoes colonial pasts. Just as significant, so it's not just the routes, it's also the corporate institutions that contain logistics in their myriad forms, and the violence that lubricates the functioning of these corporations. So routes, corporate forms. And finally, I will speak of our propensity to talk about the movement of goods and people in this enduring fiction of the commodity form. I will here speak of how the pernicious equivalence between cargoes and human bodies has shaped and continued to shape our logistical landscapes. Here, neoliberalism is perhaps most clearly haunted by the ghosts of our colonial pasts. Now, Aden was conquered in 1839 by British ships from the British Governorate of Bombay, which used the excuse of a ship's grounding and, surprise, surprise, outrage against British women to open fire on the port of Aden and eventually annex it. By then, the East India Company had lost its monopoly on trade in India and China, needed urgently to gain upper hand in commerce, and required Aden as a coaling station on its sea route from India to Suez. And at that point, the Suez Canal was not yet built, so overland to Alexandria and again on sea and onwards. As the city became a crucial possession of the empire, one of the most important coaling stations in the world, it was the third largest coaling station in the world after New York and somewhere in the Mediterranean basin, I can't remember where. One of the most important coaling stations in the world, and especially after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, Aden could easily be considered the most significant port in the Arab world east of Suez. With coal depots came inland trade, and as Onbarak has written about this coaling period, also came railways, tramways, telegraphs, water pumps, all of which facilitated the movement and operation of policemen, judges, inoculation officers, and irrigation inspectors deep into Aden and the hinterland. Aden was so significant an outpost that a well-known writer and poet earning a living as functionaries and merchants passed through there. Arthur Rimbaud, the famous French poet, worked as a coffee trader in Aden and lived in a house that at the time faced the sea, but which in the vast projects of land reclamation in the intervening years is now buried deep inland about a kilometer from the sea. Some decades later, the great Paul Nizan, a fabulous French writer who, if you haven't read, you must, who had run away to Aden, wrote of the transformation in commodities of trade that also transformed the infrastructures of Aden. And so I'm going to read this long passage from Nizan. He writes, "Not so long ago, Aden was a coaling station." He's writing in the 1930s. "Oil brought with it offices, docks, the black tanks of the Anglo-Persian and Asiatic petroleum, Anglo-Persian being BP today, and intrigues that roused the emotions of the potentates who have become sellers of oil and buyers of gasoline for automobiles. A little war for concessions is spreading all around. In Arabia, the smell of leather and the smell of oil that grows more insolent every month are replacing the smell of the coffee from Sana'a. But this change of products has not changed the human consequences. As with coffee, so with oil." So he then compares this oil economy and the port to coffee economy. To extend coffee plantations, European wars have been undertaken. Vast territories have been conquered in the New World, in Africa, and in the Sunda Islands. Millions of slaves have been captured and transported to the new plantations. A revolution has been accomplished, entailing consequences incalculable in their complexity, in which good and evil are intermingled, in which frauds, warfare, oppression, wholesale massacres go hand in hand with commercial enterprise. The wisdom of nations approves of all of this scheming and contracting and forcing all this profitable slavery." End quote. This intertwining of war, commerce, and transit, as Nizan called it, has continued. Aden was, until Britain was forced to abandon India, still a major way station, and even after 1947, it was an outpost of empire guaranteeing the waning British supremacy over trade routes that brought oil and commodities to a war-devastated British homeland. It was only a bloody rebellion in the 1960s. See, I had to put a counterinsurgency picture in. It was only a bloody rebellion in the 1960s that finally pushed the British out of Aden in 1967, with 1968 being the only year in the entirety of the 20th century when the British did not have troops overseas. I mean, that's an extraordinary statistic. Over 100 years later, and in the aftermath of the bloody civil war of 1994, Aden became once again a commercial prize. This time, the conquest occurred not by men of wars of the British, but by capital. And interestingly, not from Europe, but first by parastatal capital from Singapore, and later parastatal capital from Dubai, with parastatal meaning semi-statal, kind of halfway owned by the state, or its private-public status is unclear. Tim Mitchell has written about parastatal institutions. The contract that gave Dubai Ports World the control over the container terminals at Aden is said to have been secured through bribes to Ali Abdullah Saleh, the now deposed though not defeated president of Yemen. There's a swirl of rumors and a rank of stories around the port and DP World's management of it. DP World is now the third largest port management, terminal management company in the world. The other two are Chinese, essentially. There's a swirl of rumors and a rank of stories around the port and DP World's management of it. But it has become clear since that DP World took over the port and then tried to redirect the port traffic to other ports that it also operated in nearby, including Djibouti, from which it now also has been ousted because of corruption. But more importantly, it wanted to actually reroute the traffic to Jebel Ali in Dubai itself. Jebel Ali is the 8th largest port in the world, and the only port in the top 10 that's not in China or Southeast Asia. That Aden would be targeted for such subterfuge is not surprising. Its natural deep harbor and excellent location near the Bab al-Mandab make it a more inviting proposition than Jebel Ali, whose harbor in the Persian Gulf requires constant dredging and maintenance, and access to which requires passage through the Strait of Hormuz. One of the other things that I discovered when I was on a container ship to Jebel Ali is that the Shamal winds also have an equivalent as underwater currents, and they shift the underwater sand in such large measures that channels through which ships have to be constantly dredged in the Persian Gulf in a way that most other significant bodies of water don't have to be. So the Persian Gulf is actually quite an expensive place to locate a port, precisely because of that. And yet Jebel Ali, the 8th largest port in the world, etc., is in the Persian Gulf, or Arabian Gulf. Sorry, I'm just going to say the Gulf. I'm not an Iranian chauvinist. That DP World engaged in subterfuge in such a brazen and shameless way, and that the government of Yemen eventually withdrew the company's contract, are perhaps more of a surprise. But in that maneuvering, also, there was something of the colonial company maneuverings. This kind of a granting of concessions, of contracts and monopolies that were essentially wrested by force, and of contracts being considered provisional as far as profits and power are concerned, so that DP World didn't feel like it had to live up to the contract that it had signed, and it was rerouting traffic elsewhere until it was forced to leave. Today, Aden's port lies in ruins after the war waged on the country by Saudi Arabia and its allies, including the United Arab Emirates. In the swirl of conspiracy theories, one hears that part of the reason for the war is Saudi Arabia's stoking of sectarian wars, but also have access to routes to the Indian Ocean for the transport of oil. This particular story is underwritten by the WikiLeaks memo, the WikiLeaks Saudi memos that came out. There was one particular memo in which Saudi grandees actually discuss Omani or Yemeni routes to the sea, to the Indian Ocean, for oil pipelines. But as likely a scenario is also the destruction of Yemen's transport infrastructure in favor of competing ports on the Red Sea. For example, Saudi's King Abdullah port, which is being constructed, now the price of oil being lower, one wonders how that's going to go. Or the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, Jebel Ali. There are even rumors today that the revival of the port of Aden will depend on it being incorporated into the networks of trade that DP World ties together throughout and beyond the region. So there are actually, again, recently, once Aden was recaptured from the Houthis, there was a news item about how the UAE was going to help Yemen rebuild its transport infrastructure. And one wonders, of course, it would have to be DP World, because that's probably the most significant. Of course, airlines would be really important too, but DP World is huge. This brass knuckles form of geopolitical economy is unsurprising given the ways in which dream worlds of strategy are imagined in layers of power. And Aden is considered a strategic stronghold, not only for trade, but for military expansion across the East. In a different context, in his magnificent Moby Dick, I can't talk about logistics and not talk about Moby Dick, Melville has written about how commercial whaling, a kind of an equivalent, a 19th century equivalent of our work, and conquest went hand in hand. He writes, if American and European men-of-war, warships, now peacefully ride in once savage harbors, let them fire salutes to the honor and the glory of the whale ship, which originally showed them the way and first interpreted between them and the savages. Much the same could be said of the East Indiamen, the East India ships. Where they went, the empire followed. The inextricability of commercial and military aims, of course, is crucial to the governance of both state and commerce and of the seas. So these were the whaling, US whaling routes up to the beginning of the 20th century. And what's interesting is the ways in which it overlays the US annexation of possessions in the Pacific Ocean. So I think that overlay of commercial and military or sovereign power is quite fascinating, actually. When last year I traveled on a container ship from Malta to Dubai, which I'm hoping to do again this August, I have to confess to being overwhelmed with awe for the sublime sea, with fascination with the vast behemoth of machinery carrying me and thousands of tons of good in the seas. Standing on the deck and looking out to the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, made me want to think of the sea as something eternal, transcendental, grand. You usually get romantic and sentimental when you look at the sea. And yet, the sea is made as much as the land is. Underwater cables crisscross seabeds, and as a fabulous new book by Nicole Starosielski tells us, this geography of undersea networks contains histories of cable laying, militarization, and economic deprivation, where new modes of spatial organization have led to displacement of local residents, where the cables fall, people are often moved out, an enclosure of vast public spaces, and a reorganization of racialized labor regimes. It has always struck me that the way to think about the sea as geography is to think of the sea not only as this three-dimensional space with the palimpsest of power embedded therein, but also to think of the sea as history. This means that history includes the invisible routes of trade that connect long-standing bonds of commerce and trust from coast to coast, the three-dimensional layers of human labor, which includes cables and shipping channels, but also bones of sailors, soldiers, slaves, indentured workers, and migrants. History strangely shows us the consistency of the maps of war and trade across the centuries. So from the whalings to the annexation, and from the trade routes of today to the cables, and they're the same trade routes that were significant in the 19th century and 18th century and even before. Today, what is fascinating is the extent to which these maps of trade, communication, and transport are also maps that can be overlain by cartography of US military presence in the region. The utter embedding of US military and its malign guardianship of these routes through the control of the sea lanes and the littorals is only one part of a very specific form of securitization of the seas. There's loads of different kinds of securitization, but I'm particularly interested in the US bases. Not one that is universal, though of course many states have a naval presence in some of the more sensitive areas of the region. It is a kind of presence, a kind of legal power, a kind of infrastructural capacity that can only still emanate from a world metropole whose demise is far too often predicted far too soon. So China today is a shipping powerhouse. It's in fact the shipping powerhouse. And yet, the bases throughout the world are the US bases. So that power, that infrastructural military power is still quite significant. And why? Ports are strategic assets. Commercial ships can be commandeered to haul material and personnel for war fighting. So both in 1991 and 2002-2003, the US extensively used commercial ships in order to transport both its military personnel and its material from the US to the Persian Gulf and also to be able to fly them to Afghanistan. Logistics firms become war-fighting machines and adjuncts of military logistics operations. For example, DHL's biggest client in the Persian Gulf is the US military. And this has been true in every war fought by the US in the Middle East. US Army Corps of Engineers has been crucial in the construction not only of the ports and dams and roads in the United States, but throughout the world. In Saudi Arabia, in Oman, in the Gulf, the engineering expertise of the US military has gone into the creation of a vast infrastructure of transport that, which is commercial, but that can be quickly and easily transformed into a warfighting asset. And when the war is done, or done temporarily, these warfighting assets can be transformed again into instruments of capital trade and commerce, capitalist trade and commerce. As Deborah Cowan has described in her extraordinary book called The Deadly Life of Logistics, US bases and detention centers in Qasr in Iraq, Camp Bakka, or in the Philippines are transmuted into logistics centers. So Camp Bakka, which was one of the biggest detention centers in Iraq, was transformed, once the US withdrew from Iraq, was transformed in Qasr Logistics City, which actually, if you Google it, it comes up with a really flashy website. And it is now actually the largest container port in Iraq. This fungibility, exchangeability of the military and commercial functions of infrastructure is of course nothing new, and roads, markets, and schools were the holy trinity of colonial pacification throughout most of the 19th century. As far back as the colonial conquest of Algeria in the 1830s, Marshal Bugeaud could write about the construction of roads as not only conduits for cavalries, but also as routes of trade and civilization, all of which were seen as crucial to the pacification of intransigent and backwards natives. So this was the route making. But the sovereign form of control over trade routes needs the gunships only some of the time. What is most striking about the logistics landscape and the entities that forged them is the structural and political qualities of those corporate entities, which on so many different levels seem to be haunted by the sovereign corporate form of the East India Company and other colonial companies that were so significant in the 18th and 19th century. This corporate form, for example, the joint charter company or joint stock company, this form is not so much about the management of resources or their allocation, but about the extension of particular regimes of private property across the surface of globe. As Joshua Barkan's work on corporate sovereignty has shown, and as Lauren Benton's amazing work on the laws of colonialism has proven, that essentially it is about a kind of a exportation of regimes of property ownership to most of the world which was colonized. This form is not, sorry, I said that already. And it's also about the structuring of ownership, dispossession, and exploitation through a series of legal apparatuses that even in the face of cacophonous discourses of independence from the state, you know, the empire of free trade, etc., or calls for small government, ultimately, these forms of corporate ownership are entirely beholden to the state, its police and military force for protecting it, and the state's resources for the making of the world around it, including infrastructures. This is particularly true of the varieties of corporate bodies that support shipping precisely because of the size and capital intensity of the sector. Corporatized port authorities, private or public-private terminal operators, shipping firms, construction firms, including dredging experts, inter alia. All of these corporations are extremely capital intensive, and therefore to protect their capital, they really need the state to push them forward. Let's not forget that maritime infrastructure and logistics involves also huge legal scaffoldings. They need property ownership and land tenure regimes and laws. They need questions of maritime access. They need questions of nautical boundaries to be settled, and underseas topographical control, things like continental shelves or exclusive economic zones, or a whole series of different kinds of legal apparatuses which essentially extend a particular corporate form of private property ownerships from metropolitan centers around the world. A corporation which acts for, in lieu of, and alongside the state can address these complexities and benefits from the shadowy boundaries between the state and supposedly private sector on the one hand, and by virtue of being private, enjoys immunity from most legislation and public scrutiny on the other. This is like DP World. Because it's got state funding, it gets bailed out before anybody else, but it's supposedly a private company, and therefore it is not open to scrutiny by any kind of public. especially when these companies operate in places where legislation occurs by fiat rather than democratic deliberation. This residue of the mercantilist era, the corporate form, and the professional militaries that secure their free trade throughout the world belies the standard classical economic histories of the era of industrial revolution, for example, terminating mercantilism. This simultaneity of state-corporate co-imbrication, which is characteristic of mercantilism, with fantasies of free trade and laissez-faire policies, which are ultimately secured actually by state policy and a standing army or navy, is profoundly characteristic of our era today. I can't but think of this colonial past when I, for example, see the Troika's pressure on Greece to privatize and reform, which is immediately followed by the Chinese trying to buy a stake in the port of Piraeus, or, for example, the German parastatal corporation Fraport AG taking control of Greece's air cargo and regional airport infrastructures. So you supposedly have neoliberalization and reform, but what you end up having are actually parastatal or state-owned corporations from China and Germany coming in and swooping down and buying these things. So essentially it's a movement of assets from the states, from poorer states to richer states. It is also, however, important to recognize that although a vast amount of capital and control and colonial impulse still emanates from the northwestern Atlantic littoral, that capital accumulation in specific regions, and here I'm thinking of Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the like, also extend their repressive regimes of control and exploitation to various ports near and afar, and bring with them their capital-specific modes of governance exempted from regulation. So, for example, Dubai Ports World has inaugurated the London Gateway Port, which is going to be probably the largest container terminal in about 10 years in London. And as a condition of its investment, it has denied union recognition to the landside workers in the port. So here we are in the UK, and they cannot have union recognition on a port in the UK because DP World manages it. In imperial conditions, this blurred line between the corporation and the sovereign body, in this case of the empire, becomes even more instrumentally vague and opaque. The East India Company, in some senses, again, I think you need a password, is an excellent predecessor for many of the companies that have been crucial in the construction of logistical infrastructures. Ports, coaling stations, shipping channels, harbors, shipping agencies, or factories, as they were used to be called, military offices, and so on, were all infrastructural side effects of the East India Company's exploitation in the Indian Ocean. But what is interesting is that what you see is, again, the same kind of regimes of extraction and exploitation also occurring in the Middle East, where the side effect of it is the construction of railroads, roads, ports, warehouses, and urban landscapes. I have been struck by the ways in which the transport and other kinds of infrastructure in the vast majority of the Arabian Peninsula has been developed as part of the process of profit-making by perhaps the two most important companies of the peninsula historically, what we today recognize as British Petroleum, BP, and Aramco. In both instances, these petroleum companies had to actually construct cargo ports in order to unload goods required to build oil infrastructures, plants, wells, refineries, and oil terminals. I was earlier mentioning the fact that Abdurrahman Munif, actually in his Cities of Salt, has this wonderful passage about how these enormous ships arrive, but they cannot come close to the port, close to the shore, because the shore is actually quite shallow and sandy. And so the ships stay far out, and barges or ships unload, barges or boats unload the ships. But they had to actually construct entire proper ports with harbors and piers in order to be able to import drilling equipment, pipes for pipelines, and various other kinds of heavy goods. So long before they ever drilled for oil, they actually started building ports. In both instances, both BP's and Aramco's, the company's major stock owners have been entities based overseas, so not in, for example, Kuwait or in Saudi. In both cases, the respective militaries of Britain and the US were from the very first mobilized to defend these ostensibly private corporations' holdings. So, for example, the US set up the strategic air base in Dhahran, immediately next to, of course, the headquarters of Aramco. Both these companies had larger or smaller development programs in the countries in which they worked, which was predicated on improving the health and education of a population that could then serve as workers for the company. They actually explicitly say this in their documentation, that they are providing education and health services because they don't want malarial workers, for example, that are going to be absentee from work. Both BP and Aramco's work was also predicated on a form of capitalist class formation in which the racialization of working populations, whether through importation of workers from India or through the importation of the Jim Crow racial regime from the US, as Bob Vitalis has written, allowed for maximal exploitation. And as we know, this articulation of class through race is profoundly characteristic of colonial regimes of capital accumulation. But to go back to logistics and container shipping, if we were to think of shipping and transport, of the logistical landscape, as not only the awesome spectacle of container shipping, then it would become clear that, that without the vast transformation of infrastructures, which were wrought to construct an oil industry or mining in other parts of the world, we wouldn't have many of the cargo ports or rails or road networks and other forms of transport infrastructure in the Arabian Peninsula, which makes the region an unlikely transportation powerhouse. In this, the colonial echo is clamorous. The transformation of economic, political, social, and physical landscapes, and especially labor relations, are fundamental to the profit-making ventures of these imperial corporations. As Bruce Robbins has written, infrastructure needs to be made visible in order to see how our present landscape is the product of past projects and past struggles. Much of this transport infrastructure is completely invisible to us because the ports are often hidden behind barbed wire fences. You can't get close to them. You can look actually at the Beirut port from here, from the end of the little running, jogging Corniche thing at the end, but that's about as close as you can get. And in fact, it's extremely bureaucratically difficult to get into the port of Beirut. I got a tour of it, and it required, I don't know, 15 stamps. The only way that I could get into the Jabal Ali port was actually to arrive by ship, because over 2 years I tried to get on from the land side, and I was not given permission. A final theme that I would like to discuss, and which is perhaps most relevant to the central, in some senses, to the ways in which the Arabian Peninsula works today, is the prevalence of a phrase that dominates so much writing about shipping. This phrase is goods and people, as in the movements of goods and people across borders, or the single market for the mobility of goods and people. And of course, this is bandied about wherever there is single markets being made, as in Europe or GCC or whatever. It is inevitable that one would think not only of goods and people, but also of people as goods or human cargoes. Although it is clear that these equivalences between goods and people are specious and contradictory, the very fact that they're made today says something about the commodification of bodies and persons. In looking at the development of the ports and shipping infrastructure of the Arabian Peninsula, it's impossible not to think of how war and trade have been crucial to the making of these infrastructures through the production of vast bodies of migrants. This is a complex story in which I'm still trying to work out, and in fact, I'm working on archival stuff with it, but the bare outlines are this. The post-Second World War formation of the State of Israel led to the expropriation and expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, many of whom made their way to the Arabian Peninsula. It is fascinating to read statistics of who worked on the oil terminals and ports and railroads and the construction of these, and roads that transport oil and consumer goods in the fast expanding oil cities of the Gulf littoral. The percentage of Palestinian workers, many of whom were skilled and bilingual, building roads, offshore platforms, and railways, went from a negligible 0.7%, I believe, in Saudi Arabia in 1947 to 17% of the workers in 1948. And they were considered to be very good workers because many of them had already sets of skills like welding, for example, which were considered to be very needed in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait. The presence of Palestinians as often the second largest category of workers after Saudis or Kuwaitis, for example, in the making of Aramco infrastructures, or their prevalence in the making of Kuwait's ports, offshore platforms, road, and of course its oil company, the Kuwait Oil Company, which was a BP company, is something that is only being studied and understood today. Although, of course, Ghassan Kanafani was writing about this decades ago. As an aside, I used to read Men in the Sun as a kind of an allegory of the Palestinian condition. And then I reread it recently, and I actually found it to be one of the most deeply researched, empirically accurate, very realistic story about migration to the Gulf. And some of the stuff that it has, for example, about tap line stations and stuff, are things that have been forgotten, and they're absolutely wonderful. So, such a great book. And of course, this kind of a movement is hugely crucial to the making of capital. But this transformation, however, continues. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Palestinians, Jordanians, who were probably also Palestinians, and Egyptians were the largest population of foreign workers, migrants, working in these Gulf countries. At the same time, looking through the British Archives papers, the British officers who are actually viewing these workers, and particularly on ports and things like that, they found the Arabs in particular, and Palestinians especially, they found them very troublesome. They used the word emotional a lot about them. So I've been reading through the archival documents that show us the extraordinary turmoil of the late 1950s and 1960s as a time of strikes in the docks. Some of these strikes were over questions of wage and labor conditions, many of them were. And some of them were actually over questions of solidarity with Palestinians, and after 1956, solidarity actually with Egyptians, with the Israelis, British and French invading Egypt. Many of the workers on the ports refused to, for example, unload ships from France and Britain. But also in one instance, there's a really interesting thing where they saw a six-pointed star on a bag, and they thought it was the bag was coming from Israel, and so they actually went on strike. They stopped unloading the whole ship. But even other Arab migrants, many of whom started working in large numbers in the oil-producing states in the 1960s, were really considered troublesome. If they came from Egypt or Lebanon or Aden, they could bring with them the intransigent labor politics that they had learned in the unions of those countries, not to mention the pan-Arabist, communist, Nasserist, and Ba'athist policies, which, according to the British, found fertile grounds in the labor movements of these ports, docks, and seafaring. So we have this, then there is another shift in the sending origins of those migrants, whose labor has literally forged the infrastructure of trade we see today in the Gulf. On the one hand, you have this incredible pressure by these strikes by emotional Arabs in these transport infrastructures in the Gulf, but you also have these massive neoliberal shifts in world economy in the 1970s, which sees the rapid rise of first Japan and soon thereafter Korea and China as factories of the world. The mass production of cheap goods in this Pacific littoral, and especially in China, then leads to the transformation of economies in places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Southeast Asian archipelago nations, where small producers and artisans are being put out of business and people are losing livelihoods precisely because these Pacific countries are becoming massive producers of cheap goods. This process of enclosures, which is exacerbated by civil and interstate wars in the South Asian countries, as well as processes of urbanization and the emergence of a personal debt economy, has led to a mass movement of workers from Asia to the Gulf, in whose broad shape echoes some of the movements of indentured workers to the plantations of East Africa and the Caribbean in the 19th century. There are actually 1960s documents from the British which specifically mention that because of these emotional Arab workers, and because many of these Arab workers are protected by powerful states, like for example Egypt, it might be useful to bring in Pakistani and Indian workers who are not as protected and whose numbers are much higher, and they can be brought in with a lot less trouble. And so there's actually some thinking by the British about this displacement, but there are also massive neoliberal pushes from the transformation of world economy, and of course with the massive injection of price of oil in the 1970s, you have much more need for infrastructure construction. These migrants, indebted, expropriated, unprotected, even by their own governments, have displaced the slightly more protected Arab workers in the Arabian Peninsula. This story of migration has been told beautifully by a range of scholars, but what I want to emphasize here is that its geography is not simply a bicoastal one. It doesn't just go from the coasts of South Asia to the Arabian ones. It's a geography that has to by necessity include the transformations in the economic regimes that are forged in Washington, Brussels, and London, the emergence of new economic powerhouses in the Pacific Rim, and the increasing necessity of the transport of goods and, yes, people from one location to another in search of ever more profitable and expansive accumulation of capital. What guarantees the profitability and stability of this process of capital accumulation, of course, is the racially structured infrastructures of migration, which are set up in such a way as to always guarantee a reserve army, not only of the unemployed, but also of the unprotected, to create populations that can be pushed and pulled and threatened not only with the economic weapon, but with the force of deportation, ejection, or exclusion. What makes ports and transport infrastructure a fascinating site for the study of such labor hierarchies is that once the menial work that goes into the construction of the sites is completed, once these infrastructures are actually operational, the labor regimes that keep them functional are far more hierarchical, racialized, and determined by global striations in geopolitical economy than even during the time of the construction. So one of the things that I've been doing is I've been using LinkedIn to get a sort of a map of what nationalities of people work in what positions in these companies, because those statistics are notoriously difficult to come by. LinkedIn is quite an interesting tool for that, at least for the top range of workers. And what becomes clear is that in this hierarchy, the European managers and technical experts are then followed, interestingly, by Indian clerical officers. So the second range often come from India, China, Philippines, and Indonesia, many of whom are also the technical workers who operate the very quite technically demanding things like cranes that unload boxes from container ships. And the Pakistani, Tamil, Sri Lankan, Nepalese menial port workers who occupy positions that are radically distinct from one another. In his reading of Moby Dick, C.L.R. James described the workers aboard a ship as the World Federation of Modern Industrial Workers who owe allegiance to no nationality. They owe no allegiance to anybody or anything except the work they have to do and the relations with one another on which that work depends. This utopian view, though, as much as I would love to believe C.L.R. James and Moby Dick, belies the deliberate production of difference at these ports. These differences manifest not only in the variations in salary, level of education, and access to state resources, but also in the quality of the workers' housing, the social environs enjoyed by them, the urban neighborhoods and landscapes these workers occupy, and the extent to which these workers can also bring families with them to their places of work. The ports exemplify this striation of workers unbelievably well, partially because the walls of language and community that separate these workers from one another and make a mockery of allusions of utopian ports and ships are precisely the technologies of divide and rule, which are couched in neoliberal language of expertise, labor market structure, and recruitment networks. These residues, echoes, and hauntings by colonial forms of landscape formation, firm structures, and labor commodification, however, although I constantly referred back to this colonial past, it doesn't necessarily speak of an unbroken or totalizing colonial history, with the beginning of the story somehow in the East India Company offices in London, and culminating in the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. But rather, they do speak of a stubborn persistence of forms of commodification, of land, humans, and money that Polanyi so eloquently wrote about. It seems that today we live in a world that Amos Césaire sketched for us so eloquently, a world in which the decisive actors are the adventurers and the pirate, the wholesale grocer, think of Walmart, which is one of the biggest logistical companies in the world, and the ship owner, this is Amos Césaire talking, the gold digger and the merchant, appetite and force, and behind them, the baleful projected shadow of a form of civilization which at a certain point in its history finds itself obliged to extend to a world scale the competition of its antagonistic economies, end quote. And this, antagonistic economies on a world scale, and a vanguard of pirates, merchants, and ship owners is the world that I hope to have sketched, however briefly and inadequately. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions you've got.
Clarification.
Yeah.
Did I understand you to say the British continue to control the kind of pattern of labor and development in the 70s after they withdrew?
Partially because they had many informal roles as advisors to, every single emirate on the littoral of the Gulf, with the exception of Kuwait, had British advisors in various positions of power. And many of those emirates didn't actually have labor offices until the 1980s. So they didn't have, the labor regulation came in very, very gradually, coming in with workmen's compensation sometime in the 1950s or 60s, and then eventually in the 1960s and 70s, other forms of labor legislation arrives, and then finally in the 1980s, they actually set up sort of labor ministries, which means that in the interim, the people who determined who actually, what the labor conditions were, or who tried to mediate between workers and companies, actually ended up being the British who ran various companies, because the largest companies in all of the Gulf littoral countries, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, were of course the British were the prevalent force in the engineering firms and in the oil firms and in the shipping firms, and they, Gray McKenzie and Halcrows and Costains, and then of course all the various subsidiaries of the British Petroleum. So even though they were officially not there, they were no longer the protectors after 1971, they were actually in positions of power that were absolutely extraordinary. So one example that I recently have learned of is whenever you ask somebody who has worked in Dubai to tell you something about the history of shipping in that country. There's a kind of a standard narrative about how Sheikh Rashid, Sheikh Mohammed's father, came up to a hill in Jabal Ali, and he had with him his advisor and the chief engineer from Halcrows, which is an enormous British firm that has built everything, including the Channel Tunnel. And Sheikh Rashid said to them, I have a vision of Jabal Ali port being built here. And he took a stick and drew on the sand what he wanted it to look like. And he said to, I'm serious, this is like the mythology. And he said to the Halcrows guy, you have to have the blueprints for me by noon. This was 5 o'clock in the morning. So you look at this and it's like Sheikh Rashid's vision. What I've discovered since is that, of course, the vision emerged out of the Scottish financial advisor he had by the name of Bill Duff, who set up customs, who organized funding for first Port Rashid, which is now a cruise ship port near the creek in Dubai, who then organized finance for Jabal Ali, who probably put the idea of Jabal Ali in his ear because Port Rashid was becoming massively congested, and so they needed a new port. And on top of all of that, who probably actually also wanted to make sure that at the time blurred boundaries between Dubai and Abu Dhabi were defined by putting Jabal Ali as far close to Abu Dhabi as possible, so that it essentially established a natural border. And this was the British doing this. But they also were doing all sorts of other things. They were defining the the industrial relations processes. They were, the labor attaché would meet with so-and-so, and they would decide between them what would be a good way to have a kind of a safety valve, so that, for example, what would they give to the workers that were on strike in such and such place, so that they wouldn't go further or become communist or do whatever. And there was the conversation between the official labor attachés and people sitting in embassies then, no longer the political agency, the advisors who ostensibly worked for the shuyukh, and the shuyukh themselves, was a three-way conversation in which even the local merchants didn't have a role. So yeah, they determined policy well into the 1970s. Things changed towards the end of the 1970s and 1980s. But even today, if you go to most of those Emirates, and by Emirates, I'm also including Qatar and Bahrain, the British are hugely significant figures in most of those economic decision-making processes. Hi.
Thank you. I was wondering if you have something to say about in this story about the sponsorship systems. In terms of the way it structured labor relations. And then I was thinking you had the example of Aden in the beginning, which Yemen, as far as I know, never had a sponsorship system.
No.
So I don't know, do you have something?
Okay, so I haven't worked a huge amount on the origins of the Kahala system, but apparently it's a much newer concoction than it has ever been, partially because of the sponsorship system requires a kind of a control over people's entry and exit, which requires documentation and sort of biopolitical control, and that's a much more recent occurrence. There's a PhD student at NYU who I believe is working on the Kahala system and its origins right now, and in fact there are some really interesting stuff that does have to do with the way that the British controlled the entry of migrants into Aden and into Bahrain, not into the other Emirates. But they were very, very cautious about who was allowed to come into Aden. Not very successful, but very cautious about who was allowed to come into Aden and into Bahrain. And so they defined many of the rules around entry of migrants, perhaps not the Kahala exactly, but into the entry of migrants into those places. I'm not, in terms of how it works, obviously, you depend on the sponsorship of a worker who then has control over your ability to exit. If you don't, if they fire you because they have your sponsorship, unless you can find another sponsor, you have to go, you can be deported, you have no recourse to finding a job on your own, etc. And the system, I think, actually really does emerge also with, or become much more consolidated in the era of South Asian workers being the prevalent workers, because up until even the 1960s, many of the Arab country citizens, for example, Egyptians, could travel through most of the Gulf without passports. So, yeah, one of the documents that I saw was about this organizer, this union organizer I was mentioning earlier, Anwar Salameh, who was a Egyptian union organizer, coming to Bahrain and Kuwait, and the British were freaking out about him coming, but they couldn't stop him because there's, in the document it says, well, the Egyptians can travel without passports in Bahrain and Kuwait. And so this was in late 1950s. And so it, you know, based on this, I would imagine that the Kahala system is even much more recent than we imagine it being. In terms of Aden was a really interesting exception to many of these places, because the relationship that the British had with Aden was distinct from the relationship they had with the various kind of sultanates that surrounded it. And of course, that was completely different than what was then North Yemen, which was an emimate, completely and totally separate, and did not have the kind of protectorate relationship. Whereas Aden was a colony then surrounded by protectorates and an independent nation there. And the British, as I said, were very careful about who would come into Aden, partially because, like in the 1940s and 50s, although they desperately needed labor to come and work, they didn't have enough housing to provide. There were shanty towns springing up, and because many of the workers that came in were actually quite intransigent, and you read about strikes constantly in Aden in a way that you don't about anywhere else actually on the peninsula. They really did want to control the coming in of workers from other places, but they were having a lot of trouble in doing so. The Kahala system didn't, I don't think, work, partially because I think by the time that it was established elsewhere, the rule of the British over Aden and South Yemen had ended already. So, sure. Yeah.
You mentioned, again on Aden, the exit of the British in 67, 68, and then the reunification in 1994.
Yeah.
But, can you speak of what happened in between that period with the government of National Liberation Front? How much were they able to circumvent this sort of imperial, or how did they deal with these imperial routes? Were they able to reclaim sovereignty in any meaningful way?
So that's quite an interesting thing, because of course one of the things that happens in that period is that they align themselves with the Eastern Bloc. And so although I haven't done a huge amount of work on that period, specifically on Aden yet, you do read quite a bit about how the Soviets were actually hoping to develop Hodeidah, the port of Hodeidah, as a warm water port. And in fact, they established a small naval base there. In those years where South Yemen was a socialist country. And there were also development programs that were being funded to some extent by by the Western Bloc. But by and large, actually, most of the funding that was coming into the port construction, etc., was strategic funding that Soviet Union was putting in there out of interest over sort of access to warm waters. what you then see, which is also quite interesting, is that in the 1980s, I've been going through old World Bank reports, and in the 1980s, the World Bank actually becomes interested in doing investments in port construction and transport infrastructure in South Yemen. So even though this is an ostensibly socialist country still, you're seeing the entry of the World Bank. And so one of the things that's striking about that, of course, is that although this country is nominally socialist, nevertheless, as world economy or world economic infrastructure is changing, they are also falling prey to World Bank policies of development and infrastructure construction. I haven't done a vast amount, as I said, on that period yet. Still have a couple more years of this to do. But you do see a slight difference in the ways in which things work. Also, the other thing that happens, which is one of the most striking things about Aden, is that Yemen has the largest unions of transport workers east of the Mediterranean in the Arab world. And part of that is because of this legacy of both union organization before independence and the subsequent socialist regime, which it might have encouraged state unions, but nevertheless, they have very, very powerful, very, very strong unions. And what has been particularly interesting is that they are so powerful that despite the whole death and destruction that has been going on, apparently they've been getting paid despite the fact that all the ports are closed. All the workers have been getting paid their regular salary. I don't know how they're getting the money. I'm assuming Saudi or UAE or somebody, but they're getting paid still. So. Yes, but at least the port workers are getting paid, which is pretty amazing. It's surprising. Yeah, hi.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question on what you just said. Given that the decreasing reliance of all these ports on manual labor, like the idea of a fully automated container system that is completely independent of human labor, how many people actually still organize in unions without political and neoliberal pressure on the unions, but the sheer fact that there is no manual labor left to be automated?
Okay, well,
to which extent
two things. The fantasy of automation is, at the moment anyway, is a fantasy. And part of that is because anywhere that you can find labor that is cheaper than machinery, you're going to use labor, and so you're not going to automate. And the fact is that in the vast majority of the Arabian Peninsula, labor is still cheaper than machinery. Even in Jabal Ali, which is one of the most advanced ports, or in Kizad, which is a new port Abu Dhabi's building, only some of the terminals are automated, not all of them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's really important also to recognize that although container terminals can be automated very easily, or much more easily, a huge number of these ports are still bulk cargo terminals in which grain or bauxite or whatever comes, or iron, processed steel beams and things like that come in, which you still need workers for as much as you can automate. Two things. The third thing, which is also quite interesting, and I find this really interesting, and I'm wondering how this reflects. This is completely irrelevant to the Arabian Peninsula, given that only a very small number of countries there even can have unions. You have in the Arabian Peninsula, the only country that has proper unions is Yemen. Bahrain and Kuwait do have unions, but they're state-led, and they can also only work in state companies, and they don't take on migrant workers. Whereas Yemen has proper unions, so that's also one thing that goes into that. But the thing that was interesting to me is Rotterdam has the first fully automated port in the world, and one of its terminals, not port, one of the terminals, and one of its terminals is, they call it a ghost port because there's nobody there. There's somebody sitting in a control room and directing everything like a computer game. And yet, having said that, the Dutch have one of the most militant, proactive, and successful dockers unions in Europe, where London Gateway completely capitulated to DP World. DP World has set up an automated port in Rotterdam and has had to recognize unions in Rotterdam. So it is the militancy of the union and the sort of historical organization of the unions, but it's also the state laws, where in the Netherlands require union recognition, whereas in the UK it's a complete capitulation to neoliberal policies of, the investment firms. Waleed, and then, Ilya.
Two questions. One is if you have anything to say about piracy and privateering.
Yes.
Part of your story. The second is a little broader theoretical, but it's, I think it speaks to the project. I'm wondering, to what degree does it matter? I mean, you have a rough geographic focus in terms of this project. how much does it matter in relationship to, if you think about parts of Far East Asia, the circulation, there's a certain kind of history of circulation. It's an earlier phase, it's a kind of transit area.
Yes.
And then in a later phase, it becomes an area for, I guess, distribution of oil, and probably the import of consumption.
Yes.
Of goods.
Yeah.
And then military. I mean, like how much does your story matter in the sense, this kind of the material aspects of the political economy that's involved in relationship to other areas that are, if you think about, Long Beach, I mean, places where there's production, industry. I mean, there isn't, but how does that relate into, or does that matter?
Yeah.
To that story?
Okay, on piracy, which is a funner question. They say about one man's terrorist being another man's freedom fighter. One man's pirate is another man's tax collector, customs collector. And in fact, no, it's entirely true. I mean, when the British, for example, signed up all the protection things with all the Emirates, their excuse was that they were stopping piracy. But in fact, what they called piracy was local emirs collecting customs on British ships going through those waters. And the British didn't like to pay local customs fees to anybody, and so they called them pirates. And so there's this history of supposed piracy, which is in fact much the same way as the British using sort of banditry or terrorism or whatever as an excuse to go in and establish beachheads for imperial control. Piracy was also used as a kind of an excuse for establishing a beachhead at a time where the British needed access to Basra, because Basra was the end point of a traveling point down Shatt al-Arab from the Levant. So the ships could go into the Mediterranean, download stuff, and then get down on the rivers, and then come down to Shatt al-Arab, get onto Basra, and then load a ship and go to go to India. That was one route. Suez being, or the overseas transport over Sinai until Suez emerged being the other route. And so it was really important for them to be able to control those areas where people were going to collect customs on them. And so that's where the whole story of piracy emerges. What is also interesting is that, legally speaking, bodies of law having to do with piracy are remarkably similar with bodies of law having to do with terrorism. And so if one is to actually look at that kind of an analogy, then it becomes clear that what is at play are actually other reasons of state rather than actual piracy or terrorism. And of course, the reasons of state are protection of the capital movements, protection of goods movements, and refusal, a kind of a monopoly control over these trade routes, so that you refuse to pay customs to anybody, you refuse to recognize anybody's sovereignty, and in certain areas you don't even recognize other shipping companies from other flags collecting your goods. And piracy's story falls within that. Am I going to be doing anything on it? Inevitably, I'm going to have to say something about the question of piracy when it comes to Aden. But because the period I'm covering is a post-Second World War, it's mostly irrelevant to the Gulf littoral countries and Indian Ocean. It will be to Aden, but not otherwise. The second question, which is actually much more, I think, significant in some ways, but doesn't have, kind of the fun swashbuckling element about it. I think the transformations in the Middle East are inseparable from the transformations in other parts of, let's say, the global South, and Southeast Asia being in particular really important about that. East Asia and Southeast Asia being, Southeast and East Asia being really particularly important about that. And that's not only because of the ways in which, the story that I sketched, which is about China becoming a factory of the world, putting out people, essentially dispossessing people in India, who then become proletarian workers in the Arabian Peninsula. But it's also the fact that you have particular kinds of relations of trade and relations of trust that have emerged over the course of centuries, which remain remarkably resilient in the face of new forms of accumulation of capital. One example of that is that many of the merchant relationships that, for example, are involved in bilateral forms of debt, in bilateral forms of trade between the Indian Ocean littoral of the Arabian Peninsula and, say, Indonesia, were relations that were established 300 years ago when Hadhramauti's emigrated to Indonesia, to Java, Sumatra, and other places. And those relations have continued over the course of long before Telegram, for example, emerged, or long before instruments of capital movement emerged, telegraphing money over banks, things. Having a letter of trust from somebody you knew, who often was your cousin's, second cousin's wife, wife's brother, over in Sumatra, and then having the other person here, and these relations were often kin relations, was quite significant. And what is interesting is that many of those have endured. Another example would be actually Dubai. Dubai has had a very, very long history of being a smuggling entrepot for Iran. Again, it's a question of customs. What is called smuggling is essentially trying to avoid customs. And what is interesting is that kind of smuggling is refusing to pay customs. The smuggling trade transforms into a free port. It's a nice legal name, essentially, for customs-free trade. And Dubai, and that relationship between Dubai and Iran has continued to the point where Dubai is essentially Iran's port. Maybe Iran doesn't have any significant ports of note. It has Bandar Abbas, but it's crap. And so Dubai does the work for Iran. And it's interesting, again, that those relations have endured through massive transformations, geopolitical transformations. And I suspect a lot of that has to do with that kind of a sub-state levels of relations, of merchant relations established often through kinship, again, which endure over centuries. And I think that kind of a relation is also what Southeast Asia in particular and the Arabian Peninsula tend to share. Elia, and then I'll come here.
I actually have two questions. The first question is, you talked about the Piraeus port in Greece. Which is interesting because the whole time during the talk I was thinking about it because the pressures by the Troika on the Greek government through the public debt to privatize,
yes.
The way they use it to privatize ports and other than austerity, privatization is a major. And I was thinking, and when you showed the map about the weighting system, which intersects on the
yes.
stations of the US, I was thinking there was an intersection between the US military bases and the IMF or World Bank's in the global south, where they would it would be like an option to alleviate the debt to open a military base. That's the first question. The second question has to do with, we were talking about China, impacting the world and then dispossessing countries like our Indians, Pakistanis, Tamils, and all these, redefining the labor relations in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. How does this, countering this this redefinition of the workers and diversified so that they can't unionize, they can't organize. How does this counter neoliberal policy looks like? I can't form the question, but I'm like, how do we counter this policy in a way
of division?
How do we look at it in a theoretical way?
Yeah. Okay, so the first question had to do with whether or not the US basing policies map to IMF and World Bank. I think that they would in most places, but not necessarily in the Arabian Peninsula. And part of the reason is that because in the Arabian Peninsula, with the possible exception of Bahrain and Dubai, most of these countries don't need to listen to IMF and World Bank. They very rarely borrow money from them, and therefore the instrument of debt, which is used as a kind of a form of pressure, is simply not significant. And even in the case of Dubai, which doesn't have any oil resources and therefore slightly more vulnerable for that reason, when it crashed in 2008, Abu Dhabi bailed them out. So Bahrain, as I said, is the only one that's vulnerable. But then on the other hand, Bahrain also has a very interesting relationship with Saudi, which and also actually with the Emirates, where there's a huge amount of investment in Bahrain on those. And there's also a whole banking system, which is again independent. It makes it to some extent less vulnerable to fluctuations of oil, etc. And so they are developing a kind of a banking system, but interestingly, that is or diversified economy. But interestingly, that doesn't actually have to do with IMF or World Bank. That has to do with the destruction of Beirut as a banking center between 76 and 82, and where the banks shifted and they all went to Kuwait and Bahrain. So the creation of that had less to do with these fantasies about a diversified economy and much more to do with the ways in which war works. The destruction of Beirut actually as a port has been hugely significant in all sorts of ways for the Arabian Peninsula. It's something that I'll have to write about in another context. I've given a talk actually here about it before. The second question has to do with how do we counter the racialization and the production of difference between different groups? That's a really difficult question to ask. I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer. And part of the reason for that is because one can't say to these workers, set aside your communitarian sense and belonging, because in situations of extreme exploitation, the only thing that you've got are the communitarian solidarities and belonging. So you live together in the same housing areas, you share the same language, you do the same sorts of stuff, you eat the same sort of food, you know each other, sometimes you're kins with each other, and that sense of solidarity which emerges in this particularly tight form of living in a communitarian sense ends up becoming really hugely significant and powerful. That said, what is really interesting is that although this kind of a difference is produced constantly, right? It's constantly produced, and it's this idea that if you have different categories of people and they do different kinds of jobs, then what you have is the inability of the different groups to talk to each other. Not in the ports area, but in construction of infrastructure. You have had instances where construction workers of completely different backgrounds have ended up going on strike together and on sabotage and machine breaking. Unfortunately, there's very little research done on these guys because they're immediately deported, and so there's no way to find them because they've been dispersed from where their locus of concentration was. They've gone back to their villages or back maybe to another country or whatever. And so it's very hard to actually talk to them to find out what strategies they use in order to mobilize across barriers of language. Interestingly, English, although it's a lingua franca in most of these places, a lot of these people don't speak English, and some of them spoke very broken Arabic. So and their foremen tend to be the translators between whatever. The foremen speak their language, and then they whatever. But it is interesting that nevertheless they have been able to overcome that. In the 1960s, where there were a number of strikes initiated by Arab workers in the docks in Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Kuwait. And the British were freaking out because they said that the Arabs had managed to, they said, intimidate the Pakistani and Indian workers to join their strike. My impression is that at the time there was a lot of English-speaking workers, certainly between the South Asians, but also between apparently the Egyptians, the Egyptian and Yemeni workers. And so those English-speaking workers were the ones who did the job of translation between those groups, because language is the main overcoming, the main barrier to overcome. But this was in the 1960s. I'm not entirely certain how they've done it now. One of the things I'm hoping to do next year is actually to go to Kerala, Karachi, Dhaka and Manila, where a lot of these workers come from, and find, because it's impossible to get actually to talk to workers in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, wherever, to go to the sending countries where there are NGOs that serve deported workers and talk to them there and see what they can tell me about what has happened. But that's next year. First May and then May.
Thanks, Laleh. That was really, really interesting. So I have two small questions. The first is, you were talking about Jabal Ali being ranked number 8. So what criteria goes into ranking? Mm-hmm. Is it significant just beyond, like, we're number 1?
Yes.
And the second is that, you know, I don't know if this may be like later, but like in more recent times you have the emergence of these free trade zones, and you could just kind of mention it outside of these port areas. What have you kind of discussed? Do you discuss or consider their significance in terms of kind of trade and control?
Absolutely, yes. Very, 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 very good questions. So an element of Jabal Ali being, oh, we're number 8, is of course dick swinging. We have the largest building in the world, we have the largest port in the Middle East, we have the whatever. It's a kind of a masculine sense of superiority over everybody else and their grandmother. But an element of it actually is quite significant. It is. I mean, you know, why else would you build a phallic symbol that reaches the sky and is like vulnerable to fires? But anyway, so but there are, for the kind of infrastructural projects, size does matter. And the reason that it matters is because the larger you are, if you're efficient, you can potentially forestall the possibilities of congestion. So you can have a lot more ships coming in at that moment at the same time, so that the ships don't wait out at sea waiting for berths to come free. That costs both the port and the shipping company money. And so having large ports which have more berths and more capacity and also more space to actually unload containers, because that space to unload containers is now something that is at a premium. Those things do matter. And then it attracts investment for that reason. So it ends up being a kind of a vicious or virtuous circle, however you want to do it. In terms of how they measure it, so Jebel Ali is the 8th largest container port, but it's not the 8th largest port, period, in the world. Rotterdam, for example, which is the largest port in Europe in every way, is in fact the 6th largest port in the world if you count not only containers but also bulk goods, the 5 ores plus grain plus whatever. Oil, it actually is the largest oil, refined products good in the world, because it has 5 refineries on the port side. No other place in the world has that many refineries in one port. And so if you count all of that, Rotterdam is actually number 6. But in terms of containers, it is number 11 or 12. Jebel Ali is counted as a container port primarily because it's an entrepot port, which means that it is a transit port. So stuff comes in and stuff goes out. And they serve as an entrepot for Iran primarily, a little bit for their own hinterland, and very much also for Pakistan and India. So that entrepot trade ends up becoming quite significant. Again, the reason that they can be an entrepot port is precisely because they're so large, they have capacity to do it, they can serve big ships and little ships and whatever. Free trade zones are enormously important, absolutely hugely crucial. And part of the reason that they're absolutely and hugely crucial is because the development of a lot of these port infrastructures is predicated on the possibility that foreign businesses come in and set up businesses in places where there is no customs fees, no overseeing of regulations, very little overseeing of labor conditions, almost no overseeing of ecological, environmental conditions. Well, and essentially a zone that is in some ways you can set up business, etc. And some countries do it much better than others. In Dubai, for example, Jebel Ali has an enormous, a vast free trade zone, which has lots of manufacturing in it, both chemical and goods. It also has, interestingly, US military warehouses where when they're drawing down or sending stuff to Afghanistan, it's flown into Maktoum Airport, taken to Jebel Ali's free zone. And what Jebel Ali does really well is they've set up this kind of a processing center where you come in and some person sitting behind the desk gives you a form, you fill it in, and they give you an internet line, an electricity line, whatever, a business, a number, connections, whatever you want, and all of it is done in whatever, in an hour or less. And so this kind of an efficient servicing of business ends up providing an impetus for lots of businesses to come and set up shop within the free zone. Of course, what that does then is many of these businesses are manufacturing businesses. Some of them are service provision businesses, but many of them are manufacturing. And when they're manufacturing, of course, that means goods come out, raw goods come in, manufactured goods go out. And so that actually helps the port expand. In many instances, in fact, the free zones are first set up and then the port builds up on that. So Abu Dhabi has now just started CASAR, which is supposed to be a competition to Jebel Ali, and their port operation is still fairly negligible, but their free trade zone is growing very fast. And I think they're trying to do that to take business away from Jebel Ali. So.
I think there's time for one more.
Okay. Karim.
So I was wondering if maybe you mapped a little bit or something I'm interested in, something might not have been, the kind of resource flow from where they go from, and then how they change, or like especially grain. You mentioned Aden, so in the 70s, I think a lot of grain comes into Aden and it basically causes whole transformation in the backlands, and you talked about war, and so I was wondering if you have something like this, or if you plan to do something like this to kind of map the unequal exchanges of ecological goods traveling.
Yeah, we have the data for it. If you know somebody who knows GIS, bring it to us, because we're looking actually to set up a website which maps precisely those kinds of transportation of goods through the Middle East, not necessarily worldwide. But of course, what you do see is there's certain. Okay, so iron ore, for example, comes from Australia. Also coal, also bauxite. So a lot of stuff comes from Australia. Some of it now comes from East and West Africa. In fact, that's why China has put in such massive rail infrastructure that goes from ports on East and West Africa to the interior in order for the transportation of raw materials. And what is interesting is that when you look at the best way to predict where the world economy is going is to look at the importation of iron ore into China. So the tracking of bulk goods, particularly iron ore, more than anything, because it's steel is required for construction of various other things, etc. If you track that, it is always a pretty good predictor of the world economy. It also is, for that reason, it's also a good predictor with a slight lag of container shipping. So that because for example, if you're not bringing in any more ore, you don't need more bulk transport. A bulk transporter actually just went by just as we were sitting here, and therefore that means that your manufactured goods are dropping. So with a lag, you'll also have a drop in the movement of container shipping. I mean, it is the main things to look at. The big three for manufacturing are ore, oil, and coal. And then there's grain, and that's a specialization that is happening in all sorts of interesting ways. I know a little bit less about it. Christian Henderson's actually writing about Egypt and Saudi Arabia about grain. But what you do see is that Egypt is trying to specialize now in agricultural goods. They're setting up these extremely environmentally destructive programs out in the desert where they're producing goods of all sorts under extremely highly securitized conditions, where they're producing agricultural goods for everybody else. And there's been talks about investment in a main agricultural port, processing, etc., in Damietta. It already is a grain, it's got grain silos as you go by, but they're trying to expand it. And so that grain mapping is very different because it's an agricultural economy rather than an extractive or manufacturing economy. But it is a very significant one because, of course, other than manufactured goods, the thing that we need is grain to eat. And so the map of that is slightly different, and it falls primarily outside of the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt being the main Egypt and actually here being the other main, used to be Syria, but it's not here, the main sort of ports where grain and goods like that are processed. You see silos on the thing here as well. So.
Okay, well, join me in thanking Laleh.